Next, Eutropius took up the cunning profession of a pimp. He gave it his all, and he excelled at the job, keenly mastering the skills of corrupting virtue. No one could reliably protect the sacred marriage bed from his wiles. No lock could keep him out. He would even have coaxed Danae from her bronze tower. He would pretend that his boss was distraught by love. He would win over stubborn women with patience, greedy women with hard cash, saucy women with charm. No one was smoother than he, tapping a maidservant on the shoulder, slowly undressing her, and with a subtle whisper persuading her to sin. No one was more careful at finding the perfect location for furtive lusts, nor, when infidelity was discovered, at avoiding the wrath of a cheated husband. In that passage, the late 4th century poet Claudianus or Claudian describes the Eunuch Consul Eutropius's earlier stint as a pimp or procurer. It's taken from lines 77 to 90 of Claudian's poem in Eutropius, Book 1. In the previous video, which you can check out here, we covered the background to the poem. Eutropius was a eunuch, possibly from Armenia, who had risen to the high office of consul in the Eastern Roman Empire in AD 399. Claudian, the court poet and propagandist for Stilicho, the real power behind the young and weak Western Roman Emperor Honorius, wrote this biting poetic invective against Eutropius. We traced Claudian's description of Eutropius' early life: castrated at birth, trafficked, bought and sold as a child sex slave, a catamite, serving multiple masters, but ending up in the service of an imperial official called Ptolemy, who eventually tired of Eutropius once his youth had faded and gave him away for free. In the passage with which this video opened, we saw Eutropius, still a slave, transition from the life of an exploited catamite into a scheming, manipulative procurer, corrupting and seducing women for his powerful masters, marking the beginning of his insidious rise to corrupt power and influence. But even so, Eutropius would suffer further significant and humiliating setbacks before his eventual rise to power, according at least to Claudian. And I have to qualify everything by the fact that our only source here is indeed Claudian's propagandistic invective. But welcome to Ancient Classics. Now, in the passage with which we opened, Claudian purports to praise and admire Eutropius' skill as a procurer, a corrupter of women. His sarcasm is clear enough, but for me it backfires. In fact, Claudian's whole propagandistic intent seems to backfire for me. Rather than finding myself outraged and revolted, I find myself rooting for Eutropius. Hold that thought, I'll come back to it later. But let's continue with Claudian's poem for now. The sole useful role of all other eunuchs is to preserve the chastity of the harems over which they guard. But Eutropius was unique in that he prospered through facilitating adultery. Indeed, this was his very first step to high office. Even so, this was not the end of the beatings he'd suffer whenever foiled lusts provoked his master to anger. And then, despite his pleas and entreaties for all the work he'd done over the years, he'd been handed over again as a dowry for a son-in-law, ostensibly as the bride's nanny. Thus the future ruler and consul of the East would comb his mistress's hair, or stand naked, bearing water in a silver basin for his mistress to bathe with. And when grown weary with the fierce heat, she would take a nap, and then this patrician would fan her with colourful peacock feathers. Claudian packs a lot into this passage. He acknowledges that Eutropius' pimping marked his eventual climb to high office, whilst cleverly making the contrast between the role of most eunuchs, guarding over women, and Eutropius' role as the corrupter of women. But Eutropius' path to high office is not interrupted. He suffers further humiliations and setbacks, beaten when his ruses failed, then passed on once more, this time to serve as a neutered attendant of a noble noble woman. We're forced to visualize him naked, bathing or fanning his new mistress. Claudian mercilessly piles on the humiliation, referencing his future role as a consul, with dripping sarcasm calling Eutropius a patrician, which, being an Eastern-born slave, he most certainly was not. It's like a second emasculation for Eutropius, and Claudian's insistence on visualizing him naked in the intimate presence of a bathing and presumably desirable woman implicitly highlights Eutropius's earlier castration, and Claudian's not gonna let up now on body-shaming Eutropius, for now his skin had grown saggy with age, wrinkles furrowed his cheeks, his worn face was more shriveled than a raisin, cornfields are not so furrowed by the plough, nor do sails tremor so much with the wind. Disgusting parasites ate away at his scalp, leaving bald patches across his hair. As if to exacerbate the insult that would one day befall the honours of consul, Fortuna added these scars to his face, this shame to his countenance from her indulgences. His face grew pale and his bare bones were exposed, and he became a horror to his masters. His pallid and emaciated form disgusted everyone he met. It frightened children and put people off their dinner. It was an insult to all slaves and an ill omen to all who should meet him. Eventually, Eutropius's masters could gain no profit from this husk of a body. He couldn't even make beds or chop wood for the kitchen at this point, and his faithlessness meant that he couldn't be trusted with gold, cloths, or private affairs, for who would wish to entrust such private matters to a pimp? So then Eutropius was exorcised from the household, like a corpse or an evil spirit. Finally, he was free, thanks to the very contempt in which he was held. It was a bit like how a shepherd chains up a dog but keeps him well fed in captivity, just so long as the dog has the strength to guard the flock and scare off predatory wolves with his bar. But when that same dog grows sluggish, filthy, and cringes, his ears all mangled and mangy, well, then the shepherd kicks the dog out and makes a small profit by retaining the disused collar. And so Eutropius, no longer of any use to his masters and physically ravaged, is set free. Very different from the usual manumission story. A faithful, trusted slave serves his masters well, perhaps is allowed to save some money for himself, and then buys his freedom, perhaps indeed continuing on in his former master's employ thereafter. No, not Eutropius. Eutropius is completely washed out, useless and discarded, exorcised even, because his presence in the household is too costly and disturbing for his masters to bear, or at least so Claudian alleges. And yet, whilst cast out, he is finally free, and in his freedom, Eutropius turns to a life of a fraudster, which somehow leads him to securing a position, albeit a lowly one at first, in the palace administration. But there are times when being despised by all is actually a boon. Driven out from everywhere, he is afforded the opportunity to engage with impunity in all kinds of deceptions, and thus clears the way for his fated path. Whoever you may be who rules the heights of Olympus, did it please you to make such a perverse mockery of mortal affairs? That man, who was not even good enough to be used as a slave, entered into imperial service, and he who was deemed unworthy to serve a private residence was welcomed by the palace as lord. Who did not mourn when the palace first harboured this old vixen? Who did not grieve to see this cadaver, one bought and sold so many times, infiltrate the sacred imperial office? Even as Eutropius finally makes it to the palace, to a position of power and influence, Claudian has no explanation other than to attribute it to fraud, and using it as an opportunity to focus once again on Eutropius's appearance, calling him a corpse, a cadaver. Indeed, Claudian makes much of Eutropius's disgusting features, as we saw in the earlier passage too. Now, I think we can take it as read that the extremity of Eutropius's physical decline, as described by Claudian, is just pure slanderous invective. But nonetheless, there may be some truth insofar as eunuchs, especially those who were castrated before puberty, were, and indeed are, often beset by various physical disfigurements or infirmities in later life, citing both modern medical literature and a description of Roman eunuchs from Claudian's near contemporary Ammianus. Jacqueline Long notes, eunuchs have abnormally long limbs and can fall victim to osteoporosis, curvature of the spine, and joint deformities in middle age. They tend to distribute fat in a feminine pattern, much more than their genitals marked eunuchs out as mutilated men. Members of a society that used such men in daily life at all commonly would have had ample opportunity to observe their deformities. Eunuchs did look abnormal, and their strangeness could be perceived as unpleasant. Claudian takes full advantage of this perception. Indeed, he does everything that he can to emphasize Eutropius's condition and, through it, induce a visceral reaction against him. To the extent, therefore, that there is any truth in the description of Eutropius's repulsiveness, it is at least in part attributable to his early castration, a reminder of what was done to him as a child, exacerbated by his years of slavery, suffering, and, let's call it for what it is, sexual abuse. Indeed, that's alluded to by the latest physical description of him as a venale cadaver, a corpse who in his younger and prettier days was bought and sold. And this is largely where I think this poem fails to achieve its ostensible goals. Perhaps Claudian was on autopilot here. I mean, it's the oldest trope of political invective to accuse a powerful man of engaging in sexual depravity and perversion. But in Eutropius's case, well, I feel that the rumours may well have been true in their essence, if not detail. Well, those are the very kind of abuses which might well have befallen a eunuch such as Eutropius. So why did Claudian even bother? He could just have presented Eutropius to us as a ready-formed cartoon villain, a sexual deviant monster, and just focused on his corruption and perversion in office, as he will in subsequent parts of this poem. But instead, he quite unnecessarily gives his target a tragic but quite believable and very possibly true backstory. Thus, by drawing attention to such things and spelling them out over 150 lines or so, Claudian is not shaming or embarrassing his target any more than he could have by just presenting what's already readily apparent. Rather, he's unnecessarily giving us reasons to pity and maybe even admire Eutropius. We all know from pop culture tropes, right? If you have an evil scheming villain, a little bit scary and dodgy looking, a bad guy, then as soon as someone writes the villain's backstory, the audience grows to understand, sympathize for, or perhaps even like the villain. This works well when enriching and injecting new life into a franchise or something, and many villains of pop culture have had this humanizing treatment, from Darth Vader and Freddy Krueger to Horus of Horus Heresy fame and so on. So surely it's downright professional negligence for a court propagandist to give his patron's rival a backstory when he didn't even need to. Through Claudian's telling, we see a baby brutally castrated, sold and resold, sexually abused throughout childhood, and even the parody of a heroine's lament we saw in the previous video will strip away the mock epic hyperbole, and what do you have? A young man who has tolerated years of abuse in the hope of gaining freedom, only to be disposed of and gifted to another and kept in further slavery. And when Eutropius turns to pimping, not for his own profit, mind you, but in service to his masters, we can see someone scheming for his own survival, learning the dark arts of corruption compassion to save his own skin. Quite literally, given that Claudian tells of the beatings that Eutropius endured when his attempts to corrupt the object of his master's desires failed. And when we see Eutropius physically broken, useless, and finally set free, this not only builds sympathy for Eutropius, but even excuses or at least humanises his later alleged atrocities.
From the womb, one flash of the knife and my future was doomed, drained of my seed in a single cruel stroke. No sons, no wife, just a market to choke. Sold through Assyria, a child ruined prize. Dry glaive, they laughed at the eunuch, the pitiful shame. But every scar taught me the art of the game. From the knife I rose to the consul's trevy. No seed in my body, yet the year belongs to me. Powerful corrupter of queens, I coaxed Stephen Dene from her bronze tower, beaten and gifted as nanny once more, naked with peacock fans, fanning the whore, wrinkles like canyons, parasites in my hair. They saw a monster. Set me free like a mangy old dog, but the goddess was calling. I